Ayn Rand's critique of Nietzsche's ethics. Friedrich Nietzsche and Ayn Rand are two giants on the intellectual landscape, and both are often identified as having essentially similar philosophies. Now, while on first reading, there are reasons for identifying them, or at least seeing strong overlap. My primary purpose in this discussion is to illustrate how very different, particularly on the fundamentals of ethics and their underlying philosophies, the two thinkers are. Now, one reason why first-time readers easily identify them is that both are romantic individualists, particularly in their rhetoric. They're both first-rate writers, and because of the power of the prose, we resonate with that romanticism. Ayn Rand, for example, writing in The Fountainhead, quote, "Throughout the centuries, there were men who took first steps down new roads, armed only with the strength of their own vision," unquote. And as a young person, especially an intelligent young person with your whole life ahead, realizing that you will be the creator or the architect or the realizer of your life, that it's up to you, that is thrilling. We want to take our first independent steps as adults. We want to go down new roads, and we want to do it our way. So we thrill to that romantic individualism. Similarly, in Nietzsche, many paeans of exaltation to the uniqueness of each of us. This is from Untimely Meditations. At bottom, every man knows well enough that he is a unique being only once on this earth, and by no extraordinary chance will such a marvelously picturesque piece of diversity in unity as he is ever be put together a second time. Unquote. And when we realize that out of all of the possibilities that could have emerged, here I am, and I am unique, I am me, and this is it, this is my shot. I need to make it happen, whatever it's going to be. A second reason why they're identified is their common enemies, Kant, Plato, the socialists, and both are atheists, and they take on the entire Judeo-Christian tradition, and then more broadly the entire religious traditions that have dominated human thinking. Nietzsche's striking phrase, for example, "God is dead," means that we can't think of ourselves as mere fragments of some sort of a divine being, or that life on earth doesn't really matter, or that we have some sort of immortal soul, and that the afterlife is what it's really all about, or that our morals come from somewhere up in the sky. Instead, we need to naturalize, to realize that nature is what's real, that we are part of nature, especially in ethics. We need to naturalize our understanding of morality. Rand agrees. For Rand, morality is an objective science in the Aristotelian sense, grounded in facts about human nature and facts about reality. And it's scientific in the Aristotelian sense of having as much mathematical precision as is appropriate to the discipline in question. Now, another similarity between the two is that both are iconoclastic outside the mainstream of conventional thinkers, and they're seen as such in Nietzsche's and Rand's own lifetimes. The academics, many of them highly conventional and now forgotten, were widely dismissive of the two. Of course, a common occupational hazard once you become a professional intellectual and you've bought into a certain viewpoint is that it's very hard to think outside of that framework. And even to recognize philosophy as philosophy if it's not done in the way you have been trained. And that's on top of all the usual knee-jerk reactions that people have to any hint of a challenge to something that they take to be importantly true. For example, when Nietzsche was a young professor at Basel University in Switzerland, the philosophy professors there told their students quite dismissively, "Oh, he's not a real deep thinker, he's not really a philosopher, don't take his classes." They were intentionally trying to sabotage Nietzsche's influence there, and Rand suffered a similar fate among many who did not want to recognize her, or maybe they couldn't recognize her philosophical depth. I'll quote here Alan Bloom, a professor at the University of Chicago. Now, Bloom was highly intelligent. He could do very good scholarship, but he rather badly missed the boat on Nietzsche and especially on Rand. In his famous book, The Closing of the American Mind, he reports that at one point he always asks the students in his classes what books they're reading, what books really matter to them. And then dismissively he says, quote, "There's always a girl who mentions Ayn Rand's The Fountainhead, a book, though hardly literature, which with its sub-Nietzschean assertiveness excites somewhat eccentric youngsters to a new way of life." Unquote. Now, just setting aside the literary evaluation and focusing on the philosophy, we'll note that Bloom thinks that Nietzsche's and Rand's views are essentially the same, except that Rand's are sub-Nietzschean. That is to say, they're kind of not as good, or they're kind of a bargain basement Nietzscheanism. And he thinks that the only reason anybody could possibly be attracted to either Rand or Rand in particular is that you're just young and or weird and or eccentric in some strange ways. Now, I want to take up the middle part of that quotation from Bloom, that very common view that Rand and Nietzsche are working the same philosophical territory. I've been publishing on Nietzsche and Rand over the years, and I've developed and published at my website, updating it every 10 years or so, a table listing 124 philosophical issues: metaphysical, epistemological, human nature, ethics, and so forth. And on all 124 of those issues, those are the ones that philosophers need to think through, I quote what Nietzsche said about that issue and what Rand said about that issue, contrasting the two, and then giving their sources, right? So it's a working research tool. Now, the results so far is that only on about 10% of those issues do Nietzsche and Rand agree. That's to say, about a dozen out of 124. On about 90% of philosophical issues, they disagree, and in many cases quite substantially. And this flags the importance of studying philosophers systematically, right, rather than picking and choosing elements here and there. Of course, we're aware of the danger of taking things out of context, but obviously when you have someone with strong rhetorical formulations pointing in a certain direction, and so in many cases you bring a background set, it's very easy to take things out of context, particularly in complicated thinkers like Nietzsche and Rand. And while Rand is a demon for emphasizing fundamental philosophy and arguing that you really can't do moral and political philosophy without doing that underlying metaphysics, epistemology, philosophical anthropology, and so forth, Nietzsche too, in his more metaphorical way, says the same thing. He's a systematic thinker. Here is a line from near the beginning of Genealogy of Morals. Quote, "Our ideas, our values, our yeas and nays, our ifs and buts grow out of us with the necessity with which a tree bears fruit, related and each with an affinity to each other, and evidence of one will, one health, one soil, one sun." Unquote. Now, Nietzsche's an aphoristic thinker, and he wants us to do some work in interpreting his aphorisms and bringing apparently disconnected ones together. But he does see his philosophy as of a piece, almost as the metaphor suggests, as an organic unity. So we might notice this fruit or that leaf, but we have to realize that it comes from the twig, which is part of the branch, which grows out of the trunk, all the way down to the roots, deeply connected to the soil. The tree is a unity, as a philosophy is. So in this issue, we're going to be focusing on the issues of egoism, self-interest, selfishness, where Nietzsche and Rand have the reputation for being the most in agreement. But I'm going to argue that that's deceptive. Egoism, selfishness, self-interest, those are the fruits, right? But interpreting the fruits in the light of the roots, that is to say, in the light of a philosopher's fundamentals, that is critical.
Are you looking for a new book to dive into? Then check out audiobooks.com. With over 150,000 premium titles, they have an incredible selection of books to get stuck into, whatever your genre of preference. Listening to audiobooks makes reading incredibly easy and enjoyable. Not only do you have instant access to thousands of titles, but powerful narrators can bring the text to life, often giving a book more meaning than just flicking through the pages itself. Do more with audiobooks and start your next book while multitasking, doing the laundry, taking a drive, going for a walk, doing exercise, or something else. With audiobooks, you can even read your books with your eyes closed. Sign up today for a 30-day free trial and get 3 audiobooks completely free. Go to www.audiobooks.com and click sign up to get started. And please help support the podcast by entering our promo code OpenCollege, which is all one word. Fall in love with books again with audiobooks.com. And while you're online, please show your support for the podcast by leaving a review on your favourite media player. Now back to the podcast.
So let me use an example here, not from Nietzsche or Rand, an exaggerated example to illustrate this point. It's from Hegel, who's kind of an exaggerated philosopher himself, but he'll illustrate this point very clearly. You can find in Hegel, and I think this leads many thinkers astray when they read Hegel, many kind of ringing endorsements of freedom and true self-realization. Hegel will say that freedom means realizing your true self. And then those of us who are liberals and self-realization moralists, we're going to respond feeling like, wow, Hegel is one of ours. But then you have to ask, what does freedom mean to Hegel? What is truth to Hegel? What is the self to Hegel? And then you go on to read that by true self, he means realizing that you are not really a unique, separate individual, but merely an aspect of what he calls a collective, absolute self. So your true self is to realize that you are an aspect of a collective self. And then we put those two propositions together. First, realizing that freedom is realizing your true self, and your true self is an aspect of this collective absolute self. And then it follows that freedom means realizing the absolute collective self. But then we have to follow up again. Well, what is this collective absolute self? And Hegel goes on to say that the collective absolute self is realized in the state, in the government. In practical, concrete terms, the state in abstraction and the government in concrete reality. It's the realization of the absolute self and its plans and goals and purposes for the world. So if we follow the logic again, if freedom is realizing the absolute self and the absolute self is realized in the state, right, then freedom means doing what the state tells you to do. So Hegel then is in the position of saying quite logically that obedience to and submerging yourself into whatever the state has dictated, that's what true freedom and true self-realization are. But obviously, we're in a very different philosophical universe from those of us who start off saying that freedom is realizing your true self in a liberal, individualistic way. Now, both Rand and Nietzsche also sound the language of self-realization and egoism, but for each, the underlying meaning and then the practical implications of both end up being very different. So here's a quick sketch of Rand's understanding of what a proper ethics requires. Now, she's most known for articulating strong individualism or rational self-interest and insisting that life is an individual phenomenon, emphasizing self-responsibility, both psychologically and existentially, that every individual is also an end in himself. And for her politics, and by implication, a strong advocacy of the individual rights to life, liberty, property, the pursuit of happiness, and then a mutual respect for all other individuals having those same rights. Now, Rand's underlying reasons for this are all naturalistic. And, to get ethics off the ground, we need a few things. One of them is a factual basis for the distinction between the good and the bad, the right and the wrong. If we're naturalistic, then we have to be able to answer what in nature gives rise to a distinction between the two. And Rand argues that there is a fact in nature, the phenomenon of life, and the fact that life is conditional. As organic, living beings, we each face the alternative between living and dying. And the difference between living and dying is a matter of choices and actions that we make and undertake. So broadly speaking, Rand is saying that what is good and what's right maps onto that which is life-enhancing. And what is bad and wrong maps onto that which leads in the direction of death or anything that undercuts the capacity of an individual to live. So there's an objective, factual basis that gives rise to good and bad. But we need something else for a naturalistic ethic. We have to be capable of moral agency. And here's where volition or free will comes in, the capacity for making choices. Now, many living beings don't have volition, so things can be good or bad for them, but they're not moral agents. But human beings, Rand argues, are beings of volitional consciousness. We have a rational capacity, a sophisticated conceptual consciousness, and it does not operate automatically, rather. Right? So for much of our life, we don't operate on instinct or just have automatic behaviors. We humans need to commit to using our minds, our rational capacity to identify objects out in the world that can be taken or transformed to meet our life's needs. We have to identify what our life's needs are in the first place and the actions that we can take to enable our lives to flourish. So what we then have is three things coming together in Rand's naturalistic ethic. First, we have a rational capacity, and for Rand, that is our primary tool of survival. Just as naturalistic as a hawk's having amazing vision and the capacity for flight. Those are functional tools for the hawk's mode of living. Just as a fish's being able to swim and having gills that enable it to extract oxygen from the water. Those are functional capacities that are important for the fish in its mode of living. For humans, reason is a naturalistic capacity. It's our distinctive and our primary capacity for surviving as human beings. But it is volitional, and that's the second fact. And that's the thing that makes us moral agents. And then the third fact is that, like all other organisms, we face life or death alternatives. So consequently, then Rand, putting this together, it argues that ethics is about using our rational capacity objectively to identify facts about reality and about our human nature, identifying what is life enhancing for us and what isn't, being able to shape our character and our emotions, making ourselves into the kinds of beings that can think and act productively in the world to create the values that we're then going to consume to make our lives flourishing and happy. And that's what Rand means by rational self-interest. It's to all of our interests to survive. It's to our interest to be rational, to shape our characters in a certain way, to commit to productive action in the world. And those are all objective goods. Now, her ethics obviously has some social implications. Other people are also rational individuals with the same general needs and capacities. But to the extent that we each respect each individual's freedom in the form of individual rights, the social consequence is going to be that we'll each be able to go forth peacefully, be productive, be able to realize our dreams to the extent that we are successful at being productive. And then since each of us has different interests and different choices that we've made, we're going to then be productive in different ways, and we'll interact and trade with each other to mutual advantage. Now, all of that is very different from Nietzsche's approach to ethics. Well, he also says that that ethics is egoistic, although that's going to take some qualification later on, and that it's anti-altruistic and it's not a matter of obeying divine commands. Nietzsche starts from a much more pessimistic and conflictual and non-rationalist understanding of what it is to be a human being in the world. His historical context matters. He is thinking and writing in the second part of the 1800s. Evolutionary theory is everywhere, and he derives his ethics from a psychobiological basis, seeing that human beings are evolved bundles of inbuilt drives that are all trying and striving to assert themselves. And this most basic drive underlying everything, each of us has it, is the will to power. But human beings are not uniform in how powerful or how integrated their wills to power are. Some wills to power are very strong and assertive, while others are weaker and more diffuse. So Nietzsche then arrays human beings along a spectrum. Those at one end of the spectrum manifest what he calls a kind of master psychology. They have focused drives and very powerful drives. But by contrast, those at the other end, they have weaker drives and less integrated drives. Master types among the humans are energetic and adventurous and fearless. They delight in self-expression. But the slave types, psychologically, are more passive. They're more fearful. They're more envious of those who seem to be getting ahead in the world and having a good time. Now, Nietzsche then goes on to say, on the basis of this biological and psychological understanding of human nature, that moral codes are a derivative or epiphenomenal product. Moral codes are merely a conscious formulation of one's instinctual drives. They are our deepest needs manifesting themselves psychologically. One's morality, then, is an expression merely of one's psychobiological type. And it follows then that for Nietzsche there are two basic types of moral code. Master morality seems a natural expression of the more master biological and psychological type. It's going to affirm pride, ambition, independence, embracing danger. But slave morality affirms the opposites: dependence, humility, seeking safety, peace, and so forth. Now, also evolutionary biologically, Nietzsche adds to this premise that life is essentially conflict and expropriation. Now, just to borrow a non-Nietzschean phrase here of the times, it's nature red in tooth and claw. But the master types are confident in the face of all of the power struggles, and they embrace the world as it really is. If life is conflict and exploitation, fine, bring it on. I'll go out to battle and making war, and I'm fine with using other people for my own goals and bending them to my will. But the slave types will be fearful of the conflictual nature of life. They'll be afraid of all of the expropriation that's going to happen, particularly since they suspect that they're going to be on the giving end of the expropriation. So the slave morality is going to condemn and avoid conflict and expropriation as much as possible. So Nietzsche then argues as a moral genealogist that this has been the battle of human history, the battle between the master types and their moral codes and the slave types and their moral codes. And if you go back far enough in time, most cultures, of course, will start off dominated by master morality. But for various reasons over the course of the last 2 millennia, master morality has declined, and the slave morality has been in ascendancy. And particularly from his 19th century perspective, unfortunately, slave morality seems to have achieved a high ascendancy. We're all equal, democracy, take care of me, socialism, and desperate religious revivalism that hopes for a nice lion laying down with the lamb afterlife. Now, 2,000 years ago, there was this great master morality ensconced in Rome with its expansionist republic, and then later with the Caesars. But at the same time, further east was the Judeo-Christian tradition, well-rooted and emerging in popular Christianity. Those two moralities were completely opposite to each other. That is to say, the Roman one that had incorporated some Greek elements, and then the further east Judeo-Christian one. But then what has happened is over the last 2 millennia, master morality has declined in Europe and in most of the Middle East, and now it's variations on Judeo-Christian and then later Muslim morality in the ascendancy. And the religious moralities have to some extent become secularized, so we find the socialists and the Democrats and the egalitarians and even liberals all saying, hey, let's not be so conflictual. Let's try to get along with each other, and everybody should be treated equally, and let's be nice and share our toys. But Nietzsche wants to argue that that slave morality, however watered down, with its emphasis on passivity and selflessness and weakness and humility and so forth, that's actually a threat to the advancement of human beings. So what he wants to have is some sort of a master morality that's going to be rejuvenated. That's what's going to bring out the best in human beings, not being sheep, but being wolves when we need to. All right, now with those two initial sketches, contrasting sketches of Nietzsche and Rand, right, they are both non-religious and they are both naturalistic, but already their understandings of what the self is, what self-interest amounts to, and what their advocacy of egoism amounts to, those are pointing to very different directions. And now what I want to do is turn to how their even more fundamental philosophical beliefs set them up for those big differences, and then we'll exaggerate them.
Friedrich Nietzsche was famous for his statement that God is dead, and his provocative account of master and slave moralities, and also for the fact that Adolf Hitler and the Nazis claim that Nietzsche was one of their great inspirations. Were the Nazis right to do so, or did they misappropriate Nietzsche's philosophy? Professor Stephen Hicks's concisely written book, Nietzsche and the Nazis, based on the 2006 documentary, corrects many widespread misconceptions about Nietzsche, giving a fascinating and easy-to-understand analysis of Nietzsche's work, asking and answering a number of questions, such as what were the key elements of Hitler and the National Socialist political philosophy? How did the Nazis come to power in a nation as educated and civilized as Germany? What was Friedrich Nietzsche's philosophy? The philosophy of live dangerously, and that which does not kill us makes us stronger? And to what extent did Nietzsche's philosophy provide a foundation for the horrors perpetrated by the Nazis? Professor Hicks demonstrates his mastery of this subject using quotes and critical analysis that prove his points and show the true linkage between Nietzsche and the Nazis, and how philosophical ideas move the world. Get your copy of Nietzsche and the Nazis by Stephen Hicks on Amazon.com today. And while you're online, please leave a review for the Open College podcast hosted by Hicks himself on iTunes or Stitcher. Now back to the podcast.
Suppose you want to argue that self-interest is a good thing, self-interest. That would presuppose that you believe that selves are real. Now, what's interesting is that while Rand argues that selves are real, she emphasizes self-integration and seeing one's life as a lifelong integrated project. What we find in Nietzsche is that he consistently undercuts the idea that there are even such things as selves. For example, here's a quotation. Quote, "The assumption of one single subject is perhaps unnecessary," unquote. So maybe there's no such thing as a single subject or a self. Now later he fleshes that out, he drops the perhaps and says that the human being in fact is just a combat zone. Quote, "A vast confusion of contradictory valuations," unquote. And consequently, we're just a bundle of contradictory drives. So what we're doing is we're taking any idea of an integrated or unified self and dissolving it into a whole bunch of selves, all of them contradictory to each other. Now, if that's the case, then there's no principled advocacy of self-interest that's going to emerge from that. And then notice this further quotation from Nietzsche. Quote, "The individual, the single man, as people and philosophers have hitherto understood him, is an error," unquote. I'm going to pause the quotation. Notice that the individual is an error. The single man is an error. Quote, "He does not constitute a separate entity. An atom, a link in the chain, is something merely inherited from the past. He constitutes the entire single-line man up to and including himself," unquote. So what you are then on that quotation is a collective being, right? You've collected all of your ancestors and all of their deeds all the way up and into yourself. You are a spread across time collectivized being. Now next, an advocacy of self-interest as a moral theory should also presuppose that human beings are able to choose, that they're creatures of volition. That is to say, we are capable of moral agency. And as a result of that, we can be held responsible for the actions that we have chosen. And that means moral egoism is going to be based on the view that human beings have free will. Now, Rand, of course, strongly emphasizes the volitional nature of our consciousness, and she has a very robust understanding of individual human agency. But what we find in the case of Friedrich Nietzsche is an explicit and repeated denial of free will. It doesn't exist. We are before, quote, "a brazen wall of fate," unquote. Notice that. A brazen wall of fate. That's what we face. And carrying on this quotation, "We are in a prison. We can only dream ourselves free, not make ourselves free," unquote. Another quote, "The single human being is a piece of fatum from the front and from the rear," right? Fatum, the Latin in the original, fate. Another quote, quote, one necessity more for all that is yet to come, and to be always necessitated by fate," unquote. And once more, just in case the point's not crystal clear, another quotation. "The voluntary is absolutely lacking. Everything has been directed along certain lines from the beginning," unquote. All right, so that's Nietzsche, anti-free will. And so while Rand believes in volition and so can advocate ethical egoism, any sort of ethical egoism is impossible for Nietzsche. And most of you could maybe argue that he is a psychologically deterministic egoistic. But even so, Nietzsche's advocacy of egoism, when we read further, is at most partial. So as we ask the question, do we think that egoism is a universal value for all human beings? What are the self's interests, its values, its principles, characters, goals, and so forth? And are they universal to the species? Now, Rand says yes. There's one universal moral code for all human beings at a general philosophical level. Same general values, same general virtues, although each of us is going to detail and particularize them in our own individual lives. But Nietzsche explicitly denies all of that, and this comes directly out of his understanding of human nature. If you believe that moral codes express people's psychological, biological types, and that human beings are along a spectrum from extreme master types to extreme slave types, then we're going to have very different moral codes in contradiction to each other. So Nietzsche is a moral relativist, while Rand is a moral universalist. For example, Nietzsche is frequently condemnatory of slave morality, but at various points he also says, I kind of understand the kinds of people who are like sheep, and they can't help being what they are. So it's natural that they would express the sheep-slave moral code. But then he puts a limit to it. Quote, "The ideas of the herd should rule the herd, but not reach out beyond it," unquote. So if you're a sheep-like person, fine, go ahead and believe that, but that's just for your type of human beings, and that should not be extended to the rest of us. And as for egoism, he also argues explicitly that egoism should not be universally extended. If you are a weakling, he doesn't want you asserting your interests and surviving and passing on your instincts to the next generations. For example, from Beyond Good and Evil, quote, "Not one of these clumsy, conscience-stricken herd animals who set out to treat egoism as a matter of general welfare wants to know that what is right for someone absolutely cannot be right for someone else, that the requirement that there be a single morality for everyone is harmful precisely to the higher men. In short, there is an order of rank between people and between moralities as well." So clearly for Nietzsche, there are different moralities for different kinds of people, none of this universalism, including this universal egoism. All right, so we're naturalists if we are Rand followers or Nietzsche followers, but where do these natural values come from? So both Rand and Nietzsche, they're rejecting the idea that there's some intrinsic source out there, a God that delivered absolute commandments, or that they're written in stone or stenciled in the sky somewhere. But while Rand wants to argue that there are factual bases for morality, the fact that life is conditional, that human beings have certain needs and certain capacities, especially the rational capacity, that there are certain policies of action that we can identify objectively that enable human beings to survive and flourish. She is therefore an objectivist when it comes to morality. But Nietzsche is explicitly a subjectivist in the philosophical sense. There are no objective facts. There are no intrinsic facts either giving rise to values. So notice what he says here. Quote, "Genuine philosophers, however, are commanders and legislators. They say, 'Thus it shall be.' Their knowing is creating. Their creating is a legislation. Their will to truth is will to power," unquote. So power wells up inside of us, and it generates values, agendas, goals, drives, and so forth. So what we are doing is legislating and imposing on the world. That's philosophical subjectivism. A few more quotations from Nietzsche on this point, so it's not just a one-off. Quote, "Our moral judgments and evaluations are only images and fantasies based on physiological processes unknown to us." So not only are they physiological, that is to say subjectively generated, we don't even know what they are. They're not even rational, they're unknown to us. They just come from somewhere inside us. They manifest themselves psychologically in the form of fantasies, and then our moral judgments are just conscious tidying up formulations of these fantasies that are based on these unknown deep drives. Now further, when Nietzsche goes on to talk about specific values such as equality, liberty, justice, and so forth, all of them he dismisses them as subjective fantasies and matters of taste. Justice, for example, here's a direct quotation, quote, "Justice is by all means a matter of taste, nothing more," unquote. Now, another deep dividing issue, how do we identify what the self is and what our values should be? What cognitive faculties should we use? Rand, we know, glorifies reason. She makes rationality a commitment to using one's reason to the best of one's ability as a primary moral virtue. Yet for Nietzsche, reason and rationality are dismissed. They're just relegated to being weak, Johnny-come-lately evolutionary faculties that we really should not be relying upon. Beyond Good and Evil, for example, Nietzsche explicitly identifies what he takes to be the most important faculty for generating and identifying our values. Quote, instinct is of all the kinds of intelligence that have been discovered so far the most intelligent, unquote. In Genealogy of Morals, written shortly after Beyond Good and Evil, he's reflecting in genealogical form or historical form. He's reflecting on the early transformation of human beings from being kind of pre-conscious or preconceptual, pre-rational beings. But then our consciousness developed in a more sophisticated way. We became more aware and self-reflective and rational. And Nietzsche has said about this, he laments this transition, quote, in this new world, they no longer possessed their former guides, their regulating, unconscious, and infallible drives, unquote. There's pause for a moment. Notice what he says, unconscious and infallible drives. So picking up the quotation again. Now they were reduced to thinking, inferring, reckoning, coordinating cause and effect, these unfortunate creatures. They were reduced to their consciousness, their weakest and most fallible organ, unquote. So Nietzsche glorifies unconscious drives while Rand emphasizes rational identification of principles. Nietzsche emphasizes instinct, Rand identifies discovery.
You're listening to Open College on the Possibly Correct Network with renowned philosopher and author Dr. Stephen Hicks, a podcast to explain the chaos, taking an in-depth look into how postmodernism is affecting the modern world and your lives without you even realizing it. Stay up to date with the latest releases and news from Dr. Hicks by following the podcast on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Minds.com and Gab, or sign up to our email list at www.opencollegepodcast.com. While you're online, please show your support for the podcast by leaving a review on your chosen media player. You can check out all our podcasts by following Possibly Correct on Minds.com. Now back to the podcast.
Now, another important aspect of egoism is seeing individuals as ends in themselves. Egoists will typically argue your life is yours. Your ego, your self-development, your flourishing, and your happiness, those are your highest goals in life. And while Rand emphasizes these points, Nietzsche denies that individuals are ends in themselves. Now, he speaks differently about the value of slave and master types, but not even the master individuals are ends in themselves, that is to say, living for their own sake. Now, here's a representative quotation right about individual worth from Nietzsche, quote, if he, that's to say any individual, represents the ascent of the line, then his value is in fact extraordinary, and care for the preservation and encouragement of his growth may legitimately be extreme. If he represents a declining line, then he has little value, and the first demand of justice is that he take up as little room, space, and sunshine from the well-bred as possible. In this case, society has the duty of suppressing egoism. Now notice that suppressing egoism. It's a social duty to suppress the egoism of those who represent a declining line, those who are weak, not up to snuff, not advancing the cause of making human beings a better species. And it's quite clear then for the vast majority of individuals, Nietzsche does not believe that they should be egoist. And if they try to be egoist, then society should suppress them. So Nietzsche then is saying that his philosophy is explicitly not individualistic. And here's a quote, my philosophy aims at establishing a hierarchy, not at that of an individualistic morality, unquote. And Rand, by contrast, is the direct opposite. She's consistently an advocate of individualistic morality. All individuals, whatever their capacities, have their life to live to whatever level they can achieve. And that's exactly what Nietzsche is rejecting. How about social relations between you and me and society, society being a shorthand for all the rest of the human beings out there? In general terms, do we think that individualism, self-interest, egoism, and so forth is to our mutual self-interest? Should we encourage it? Or do we think that to the extent that we advocate egoism, we're setting ourselves up for conflict and domination and war? Again, Rand and Nietzsche are opposite on this. Rand argues that human beings are rational, we are productive, we are creative, and to the extent that we do so, we're capable of net productive, increasing the net stock of values in the world. We can be self-responsible and self-supporting. The majority of us can produce more than we need, in some cases far more than we need. And that sets us up for having a division of labor, a society where we have specialization and then trade. And if we respect people's liberty and their different interests and their property rights, and we have a voluntary trading networks that we develop, then we're all going to be better off as a result of that. So it's a benevolent win-win view of social relationships. Rational individualism, rational egoism, and self-interest, properly conceived, are going to lead to a win-win peaceful society of traders. Nietzsche is having none of that. Quote, "Here must one think profoundly to the very basis and resist all sentimental weakness. Life is essentially," and he emphasizes the word essentially, "life is essentially appropriation, injury, conquest of the strange and the weak, suppressions, verily intrusion of peculiar forms, incorporation, and at least putting it mildly, exploitation," unquote. So life, including the different interests that we all have as individuals, is all about injury, conquest, and the exploitation of each other. Another quotation from Nietzsche, quote, "People now rave everywhere, even under the guise of science, about the coming conditions of society in which the exploiting character is to be absent. Well, that sounds to my ears as if they have promised to invent a mode of life which should refrain from all organic functions," unquote. So it's impossible not to have exploitation, not to have win-lose, zero-sum. We should embrace it. The rest is just weakness and pathetic raving. Now, that last, of course, has big implications for political and social philosophy. Do we believe in rights, liberty, equality before the law? What do we think about war and peace? On all of those issues, Rand and Nietzsche are opposed. Rand believes in not only universal rights, but the equality of rights. Every human being should be equal, especially under the law. Whereas Nietzsche wants to argue with respect to rights, quote, "For the preservation of society, making possible higher and higher types, inequality of rights is the condition." Now, I've thrown a lot of quotations out recently, and as always, I'm going to give the sources for the quotations in the notes and the transcript. As for liberty and equality for all, or liberty and freedom for all, Nietzsche was well aware of the rise of liberalism in the 19th century, with its advocacy of ending slavery altogether, making women equally free, for the prospects for stopping all kinds of conflicts and wars, and no longer even seeing war as the natural condition of human beings. And he's aware of the projecting that's going on, as the liberals were doing, that free markets and our understanding of universal rights is going to make societies peaceful and cooperative, and there's going to be all this international trade and so forth. Now, Nietzsche talks about all of those things, and he says of all of them dismissively, using the royal we are by no means liberal, unquote. As for slavery, the 19th century, of course, is the century in which the great battle against slavery is being fought and mostly won. Nietzsche says many times, both about psychological slavery and physical slavery, that he has no problem with them as long as it advances the higher types from beyond good and evil, for example. Quote, "Slavery is, as it seems both in the cruder and in the more subtle sense, the indispensable means of spiritual discipline and cultivation." cultivation, unquote. Notice the indispensable. Slavery is indispensable. And it's both in the cruder, or what we would normally take slavery to be, sense, and in the more subtle senses, the various social psychological forms in which we can all try to enslave each other. Now, Nietzsche is a literary figure as well as a philosophical figure, and one of the things that makes him powerful as an intellectual is his marriage of great rhetoric and strong ideas. Rand, of course, was a philosophical novelist, and much of her staying power is for precisely those same reasons. What I've now been emphasizing so far is kind of the differences between Rand and Nietzsche on some pretty fundamental issues. I do want to now emphasize a connection between them, but then another difference. For those of you who have read Rand's The Fountainhead, that great piece of literature, you'll recognize that one of its themes is a meditation upon Friedrich Nietzsche's philosophy, and then, more importantly, a breaking systematically with Nietzsche. It would be a very useful project for someone to work out the ways in which The Fountainhead and Nietzsche's genealogy of morals, for example, involve a significant overlap in philosophical types. So, Peter Keating, the character, the second-handing, as Rand characterizes him, he's the guy who really has no independent ideas of his own. He has no creativity. He's always looking to other people as the source of his ideas, and he's copying them. And socially, he's doing what's expected of him. He's a conformist kind of all of the way down. So he's a pretty ordinary conformist, second-hander type of person. And that maps quite strongly onto what Nietzsche calls the herd mentality type. Those who are conformist and followers of other people's needs and really just want to be part of society and affirmed by society, whatever society's standards happen to be. Ellsworth Toohey, one of the great villain characters in Rand and the main villain character in The Fountainhead. He's the guy who seeks power. Now, he's not at all an independent creative person. He's not going to be a scientist or a great entrepreneur or an artist. Rather, he is seeking power over others, and he uses as his primary tool a moral code, one that is collectivized, altruistic, selfless, sacrificing. But his moral code is a way of getting power over people by making them feel guilty about having their own goals and their own desires. And that causes them to underperform that guilt, and it makes them become herd animals. They want to expiate their guilt by going along with what everybody else is doing. But that's a way of controlling them and getting power over them. And he's quite explicit that he sees morality as a weapon or a tool that he's using as a way of getting this social power. And that maps quite nicely onto Nietzsche's understanding of the priests, as he calls them. And Nietzsche puts a kind of the priests in an explicitly religious context, but there's also a social psychological type at work here. Priests are those who are raised in a culture that has an altruistic, conformist, collectivized morality, but they themselves nonetheless have a more intelligence, and they have more of a will to power than the ordinary sheep-like follower of kind of a collectivized morality. And that sets them up for a terrible conflict inside themselves. They have this desire for power that wants to assert themselves. At the same time, they're conditioned to have this strong allegiance to a altruistic herd mentality. But because of their intelligence, they come to realize that they can use that herd morality, and they become the leaders of the flock, the shepherds themselves. And they will control the masses, control their flocks, and use the masses, the herd, as a power base in their battle against the master types. So there's a strong mapping on the priest power type, as Nietzsche calls it, and Rand's Ellsworth Toohey character. And then there's Gale Wynand, another mixed character in Rand, a somewhat admirable guy, but at the same time deeply a bad guy and a tragic figure. But he is at the same time one whom Rand presents much more sympathetically. And he strikes me as mapping strongly onto what Nietzsche's knightly aristocratic master understanding of what is good in life. There's a powerful physicality about him, an adventurousness. Go out and conquer the world and become rich and enjoy beautiful things and sensuousness and luxuries. Gale Wynand has the potential for that, and he wants to have his own independent lifestyle. He appreciates beautiful art. He's able to think for himself, and he's able to assert himself. But his way of doing so is by controlling the masses through money and physicality when needs be. So there is a good mapping of the Winan character onto the knightly aristocratic master type that Nietzsche has developed in Genealogy of Morals. But then, of course, in The Fountainhead, there's Howard Rourke, the main character and Rand's hero. The Howard Rourke type does not appear in Friedrich Nietzsche's writings. There might be hints here and there when he is praising certain types of independent, creative types, but it's not at all developed. And philosophically, Nietzsche doesn't believe that it's a fully realizable possibility. But clearly, what Rand is arguing is that the master-slave conflict that Nietzsche has developed is a false alternative. That the proper human being is neither a master nor a slave, but rather a person who has his or her own ideas, takes full responsibility for developing his or her character, pursuing one's career, being productive, being emotionally resilient, trading to mutual benefit with other productive people, but certainly being neither a conformist nor a power luster or using other people against their will. It's independence both ways and all the way down. So Howard Rourke, as realized in The Fountainhead, is both a magnificent literary and a philosophical accomplishment, and he is a strong anti-Nietzschean statement. Explicitly so, since we know that Rand read extensively in Nietzsche and was influenced by him when she was younger. So let me close with a semi-commercial advertisement, even though it's free at my website, that you do, though, go to my website and just search Nietzsche-Rand comparison table. That's for those of you who are interested in a deeper dive into these two thinkers. There I've explored some of the philosophical themes as they bear on the issue of egoism, where the two thinkers are most often identified, and I've tried to stress really that the differences between them are much more significant than the similarities. Of course, do your own deep dive, but I have listed there the 124-point table with the sources for those who want to research in greater detail.
You're listening to Open College on the Possibly Correct Network with renowned philosopher and author Dr. Stephen Hicks. Stay up to date with the latest releases and news from Dr. Hicks by following the podcast on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Minds.com and Gab, or sign up to our email list at www.opencollegepodcast.com. While you're online, please show your support for the podcast by leaving a review on your chosen media player. You can check out all our podcasts by following Possibly Correct on Minds.com.